The Lawyer Who Rocks is brought to you by Hughes Media Law Group. You can visit us at hmlglaw.com. Keep up with the podcast on social media at HMLG Law on all major platforms and be sure to follow us there. Thank you for listening and enjoy this episode of The Lawyer Who Rocks. My name is Joleen Winther Hughes. I am a lawyer who rocks.
When it comes to having your back, there ain't nobody better. This you better believe. Joleen,
I had such a wonderful time chatting with Oscar award-winning filmmaker TJ Martin that our conversation had to be 2 whole episodes. The second episode will be out next week, but until then, enjoy my conversation with him today. Today's guest and I go way, 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 way back. And by that, I mean he was just a tiny little kid when I first met him. And today, he is not only an Oscar-winning filmmaker, but he has been nominated for an Emmy, and he is just blowing the world up with his amazing documentaries. I have award-winning filmmaker TJ Martin in the house. So welcome, TJ. I'm so excited to have you. I just feel so proud of you. And I know that sounds a little condescending, but it's so great to see the children of some of the rock people that I worked with so many years ago, just, taking the world by storm. It's amazing. And it's awesome. So I'm excited that you're here to be on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
But I've known you for so long. I remember you were a little boy at your parents' rock shows back in the grunge years of Seattle. So let's talk about where you grew up, where we live, or where we lived. You don't live here anymore, but
Yeah, I grew up in Seattle. And when I say Seattle, I mean Seattle proper. I grew up on Capitol Hill for the most part, Capitol Hill kind of central district area. It kind of all starts with music, being kind of exposed to my parents were both musicians and they're both in the same band called Bam Bam. My upbringing was going to live shows and seeing them perform. And I've taken a lot of my relationship with music into the work that I do now, in terms of even at sometimes it's the only way you can kind of articulate a feeling or a tone is to communicate with my creative partner. And sometimes it's the best for us to communicate is say, listen to this song, listen to what the drums are doing here, listen to the rhythms of this, listen to the polyrhythms of this, listen to the tone or the tenor of whatever the violin in this our whole part track, whatever it is. A lot of it always comes back to music for me in terms of really setting the stage of the work.
did that really change the landscape of your childhood? You probably don't know anything different other than having rock star parents, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was, by nature of going to friends houses and stuff, you start to realize that you have a unorthodox lifestyle. And to make matters more interesting is that they were also in the same band. Whenever I tell people that meet me, as an adult, that my parents were in a punk rock band together, everyone always thinks they kind of romanticize it. It's so cool. I was primarily raised by my dad. My parents were together in the early 80s. They had me very young, at like 19, 20 years old, and they started playing music around that same time. So that's all I've really known is these two individuals that were very dedicated to music. It wasn't a hobby. It was definitely the intent was to build out a career for them. So I was kind of immersed in music, but also the culture of music. And obviously Seattle has a very distinct music culture. Now in retrospect, we can say that, but they were kind of at the center of the early foundation of that. And then on top of that, after 7 years of trying to make it work as a married couple, they divorce and continue to be in the same band. So that's just another layer of being stuck in the center of these two these two crazy artists trying to make stuff together and then live apart. But probably my formative years were after the divorce, lived mostly with my dad on Pike and Broadway in the apartment building there, right by the Comet Tavern, actually. And there was a rehearsal space around the corner called the Blue Room that they always played at, or they rehearsed at. And then eventually in middle school, we moved over to just over the hill into like 21st and Olive, basically like 23rd and Madison area, right into the Central District. And that was at this point, my mom had left the band and my dad continued Bam Bam as a three-piece, which then later became Mommy. And that's when I went to middle school. I went to middle school at Meany and Northwest. And then eventually I bused up north to Roosevelt.
Did you realize you were part of Seattle rock royalty at the time?
No, no, not at all. I don't think I had any idea of how the world perceived us. And also keep in mind, like, even the world itself didn't start giving credit and respect to the Seattle scene until somebody else made up the word grunge. It took the record industry by storm, it took culture by storm. And then all of a sudden, all these bands are being held. So even at the moment, it's just a group of really talented musicians and artists just trying to make things and finding space to express themselves through their work. So I think for a lot of people, it's in retrospect that you kind of can understand the positioning that the culture had on kind of greater American culture. And honestly, the effect it had globally, the ripple effect that it had. My dad, maybe because he was so intent on becoming a rock god, he may have thought of himself differently. But I think for the most part, honestly, I think a lot of people are still trying to make sense of it. What did happen in the 80s and into the 90s that kind of put Seattle on the map, and then it just kind of disappeared. The culture of music, it didn't disappear, but this kind of like putting a spotlight on it kind of fizzled away. And I think a lot of people got caught up in that, almost this storm of sorts. And I think people are still trying to make sense of what that storm was.
It's true. I mean, because, when I started, I was in college and I was too young to see shows. So I just started promoting shows so I could see the bands that I couldn't go to get into the clubs to see. And that's how I met everybody, including your dad and the rest of Bam Bam. And it was this really strange phenomenon when everybody was working waiting jobs and they were bike messengering, and then every now and then they get in a van and tour, and then all of a sudden the world shined its spotlight on Seattle, and then all of these people who, were just regular people, just like, your folks and everybody else that was trying to make it. Nobody ever thought that Seattle would be the hub of anything. And then the next thing you know, all these bands are getting famous, and some of them not even from Seattle, but are getting sort of the Seattle credit. It's just a really interesting retrospect. One of the things that I can tell you, at least from my perspective, with your dad and your mom specifically, is how well respected they were as musicians and performers in the community. Bam Bam never actually ended up making it over the hump like, say, a Soundgarden or a Pearl Jam or, Nirvana, Alice in Chains. So you'd see a lot of copycat bands. I won't name names, but they're out there. The industry wants replication, not innovation. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. My mom in particular, the moment she left music, she really kind of became a hermit and really retreated into her own little world. So she didn't share much about even her personal experiences. She didn't really share much about even her thoughts on, this notion of the scene. She was very complimentary towards other bands. I remember she was always felt very proud when, bands like Alice in Chains got their due and got their time. And she always would recall fondly about her times and having really deep conversations with Kurt. And I always talked about how funny he was and how much of just a nice person he was. The only thing she really talked about was always about praising kind of these other musicians. I think with my father, I think there was definitely a frustration with not necessarily being seen. Who knows what to attribute that to? I had an interesting conversation with Jack Endino recently. He remembers Bam Bam. He'd done some interviews recently and he'd been asked about them. And he was kind of having a hard time remembering how to place them in the kind of chronology of events, for lack of better terms, in terms of like how, and making sense of the grunge phenomena. And he said something interesting that never dawned on me, which is he found himself really coming into the scene probably closer to like 85, 86, 87. And that was around the time he was recognizing things were starting to kind of coalesce. There's something happening. amidst these different siloed factions of artists kind of all over the region and all over the city. And in the middle of that conversation, it dawned on both of us that that's around the time my parents actually left Seattle to play music in Europe. And part of the reason was that, my mom was black, lead singer of this punk band. And there was kind of, at least stateside, there was, in addition to just experiencing some severe sexism and racism, also just audiences and press didn't know how to position them. They didn't know what to do with them. Like, because it's unfortunate, even to this day, it seems like such an anomaly to have a black lead vocalist, female black lead vocalist for a punk driven band. They were like, well, seems to be a little bit more of an acceptance of that in Europe. So they left for 2 years. They borrowed some money from the family and dropped my ass off in boarding school in France. And they played music in London for 2 years. Those were the two critical years, like between 85 and 87, when, you start to kind of see the success, granted, ultimately the disbandment of like Green River, but that's Green River starts to kind of make some waves and all these, and then Sub Pop starts to kind of become this talked about thing amidst the community, and it's kind of everything's starting to coalesce a bit. And Bam Bam is in Tina Bell and Tommy Martin are in London. So it was the first time it dawned on me that like, oh, some of this is just like anything, is just timing, which is a really just, as we all know, depending on whatever your discipline might be bold enough to try to make a career out of the arts, whether it be music, film, writing, whatever it might be. There's just some of it you just can't control, right? It's luck of the draw, timing. And the only thing you can really do is try to focus on the things you can control, which is just making good stuff, you know?
When your mom left Bam Bam, did she continue to play music or was she disillusioned with it?
She did a complete 180. She was a very gregarious front person of a band with just, she's 5'2", but just like ball of energy. And then literally after Bam Bam, that was her first and last band. And then after about whatever, I guess it would be about 10 years, maybe eight to 10 years of committing to that band, she totally retreated and didn't play music after that. She really kind of pulled herself out of society in general. Like, when I say she became a hermit, she literally she spent a lot of time in her apartment, and I think just kind of trying to make sense of the world. And she lived that way through my high school years. She stayed in Seattle, and then once I graduated high school, she actually left, did a stint in Minnesota for a couple of years, but then spent most of her time in Vegas. Who knows why Vegas? I think it gave her the breathing room and the space to kind of to be on her own. Was she just in a different chapter in her life, and was she pursuing the things that she wanted to pursue, which is just leave a little bit less of a footprint in the world? Or was she kind of trying to unravel and make sense of what the last formative 10 years were, and not being seen over the course of that time? Yeah, and processing that, who knows?
Well, I mean, you mentioned your mom is black and your dad was white. Did growing up as a mixed race person in Seattle inform your own art as you decided to move more into your own artistic endeavors?
Oh, 100%. The reality is when you're mixed, and in my case, I'm lighter skinned, so I have this weird ability to be a chameleon. I don't see everything, but I kind of find myself in white spaces and hearing and seeing things that are they're absurd, and kind of shine a light on bias. But in that same token, to be totally 100% honest, I find myself in black spaces where at times, at least growing up, I don't find that the case anymore, but growing up, especially with kids, you're not black enough. You don't talk a certain way. Why do you listen to rock music? Like, what is that? It just doesn't even register. That has nothing to do with those individuals. That is the way with which we had been conditioned to understand what it means to be culturally black, what it means to be culturally white. And as a mixed kid, you're somewhere in the middle, but at the same time, you're neither here nor there. So you're this weird, I can be a chameleon, but I can also be super invisible. And those experiences certainly made me more introspective, and it made me probably more observational. And that's kind of a fundamental tenet that I bring into my work, is you end up observing human behavior and trying to kind of not judge it, but try to just understand it and make sense of it. And that's, most of my work has, and even if it's topical, it's still the intent is to humanize it.
Like I said, I lost touch a little bit for a few years. I know that you left Seattle to go up to Western and study. What made you decide to study at Western? Western's in Bellingham, which is a couple hours north of Seattle, for those that don't know.
Yeah, I mean, studying at Western honestly was more a result of a practicality. I couldn't afford to go out of state, and I got into the University of Washington, but I was like, I wanted to leave Seattle, so I, I studied at Western. Took a year off to study abroad in France, and it was in that year off that I started kind of leaning. Was when I started kind of reacquainting myself with cinema, because it was my dad was a big movie buff, but he was like a kind of like a B movie person. So we grew up watching like a lot of kung fu and like horror movies, and I think I started my personal sensibilities probably started getting sharpened late high school and the first couple years of college. And then I came back to Western. I actually came back to the States and decided to make my first film with my best friend. And that was actually ended up being my film school, because I didn't study film. Even when I returned to Western after making this project, I studied American cultural studies. And I actually moved to college within the university called Fairhaven, where you can kind of create your own concentration and essentially create your own major. So I would do film stuff as independent studies, and I would get credit for that. I've never really taken like an actual official film course ever, not once in my life. After returning from France, I took about a year and a half off to make this film, and that was kind of, again, it was trial by error, but the film was called A Day in the Hype of America, and it was more of a concept that actually my partner Brian came up with, and it was that it was based off these kind of day in the life of books, where there's like, they became kind of popular around that time, like 80s and 90s. You can experience the culture of a country in 365 pages, based off a photographer kind of capturing the essence of a country with a photograph a day. And so the idea for this was to do, in the transition from 1999 to the millennium, year 2000, what if we sent out multiple crews to capture kind of the essence of America and how it's handling this transition and how it's making sense of, because I think people forget at the time there was this kind of like one faction of people saying it's the end of the world. There's another faction saying that our computer systems are, this whole Y2K thing, our computer systems are designed to kind of handle this transition. And there was just a lot of hysteria, for lack of better terms, leading up to the event. And so we were like, well, what if we just shoot 24 hours as a means of exploring, the US? The biggest lesson in that film was production was whatever, a day, but I didn't realize in documentaries specifically, you're writing in post, right? You're writing in the editing process. You gather all this material and then you kind of construct a story. Well, that writing process took 2 years. So by the time the film came out in 2002, no one gave a fuck about the night transition from 1999 to the year 2000, because nothing happened. That was a huge lesson. The other big lesson was, understanding film business. It still remains a mystery, because you can package a film a million ways, but it started an LLC and sold shares, and 19 years old, that was kind of a massive hurdle. So that was kind of my first real foray into understanding cinema. And then from there, I actually kind of pulled back. I didn't make another film, like a feature-length film, for another 10 years.
Next week, I'll continue my conversation with TJ. We'll talk about his filmography, how networking helped TJ win an Oscar, and of course, what makes TJ a badass. Thank you for listening to The Lawyer Who Rocks. If you've enjoyed it and want to hear more from business badasses, make sure you hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts. While you're at it, please give us a review. It really helps us grow the show. The Lawyer Who Rocks is produced and edited by Sean Fox and HMLG. A big thank you to Aaron Jones for our theme music, to Jeff Gilbert at Hairball Media for our graphics, and a huge thanks to my entire team at HMLG. If you need a lawyer who rocks, find us at hmlglaw.com. On the next episode,
Still, I'm a big advocate of like, if you want to be a director or filmmaker, your primary job is to make the best piece of work and let cream rise to the top.
this podcast has been brought to you by HMLG. If you need lawyers who rock, visit us on our website at hmlglaw.com and be sure to follow us on social media platforms at hmlglaw. You can also follow me on Instagram at The Lawyer Who Rocks. Oh no, no problem.